The Museum of Science and History presents Mission Astronaut, a new exhibition exploring life in space. Mission Astronaut is open September 21st through January 5th. More info at mosh.org. The North Florida TPO is dedicated to transportation planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, resilient, and connected region. More information available at northfloridatpo.com. Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjax.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR and the WJCT News team.
Good morning, I'm Ann Schindler, and on today's First Coast Connect, Democrats and their signature issues were defeated across the state and the First Coast. We're getting expert analysis of what happened and why with Jacksonville attorney and local government expert Chris Hand. Then, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office defends police conduct at the Florida-Georgia game after social media backlash. We discuss what we can learn from the incident and the response. And writers and readers unite to highlight the city's unique literary voice. Join the conversation. Give us a call at 904-549-2937. You can also email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org or tag us on social. It's all ahead this hour after the day's news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Corva Coleman. Donald Trump is now president-elect of the United States. The Associated Press made the call for him before dawn this morning. Trump won key swing states, including North Carolina and Wisconsin. NPR's Lexi Shapitl reports another key swing state Trump won is Pennsylvania.
With 19 electoral votes, Pennsylvania was the biggest prize of the Blue Wall states, and Trump's win there all but clinched his return to the White House. Both candidates saw the Keystone State as critical to their success, each visiting Pennsylvania more than a dozen times. Ad spending in Pennsylvania totaled more than $500 million. The Trump campaign focused its efforts on boosting turnout in the rural and Rust Belt areas of the state, while also making a pitch for Latino voters. The strategy earned him a larger margin of victory than he saw in 2016. Lexi Shapitl, NPR News.
Turnout was heavy in many states. NPR's Domenico Montanaro says voters had top issues on their minds as they cast their ballots.
Voters said that the state of democracy was their biggest issue overall. About 35% said that. But the economy was not far behind that, and 8 in 10 Republicans said so. 8 in 10 Democrats said the state of democracy was their top issue. Abortion rights came in third at 14%, and again, almost 8 in 10 Democrats said that abortion rights was their top issue.
NPR's Domenico Montanaro reporting. Voters in 10 states faced questions about abortion on their ballots. Voters in Florida, Nebraska, and South Dakota have chosen to keep their bans or limits on the procedure. Voters in Arizona, Colorado, Maryland, Missouri, Nevada, New York, and Montana have voted to protect abortion rights, including some of them in their state constitutions. Republicans have flipped control of the U.S. Senate and will hold at least 52 seats in the chamber next year. They've won at least 2 seats from the Democrats, one in Ohio, another in Montana. They seized an open Senate seat in West Virginia. There are other Senate races still outstanding, including in Arizona. NPR's Ben Giles reports from Phoenix.
Democratic Congressman Ruben Gallego maintained a lead over Republican Carrie Lake throughout the night. Lake, a mega firebrand who's modeled her political image after Donald Trump, is underperforming in Arizona compared to the former president. Democrats have won 3 consecutive races for Senate in the past 6 years, including a special election to replace the late Senator John McCain in 2020. This year's winner will replace outgoing Senator Kyrsten Sinema, who declined to run for re-election after she defected from the Democratic Party in 2022 and declared herself an independent. Ben Giles, NPR News, Phoenix.
2 incoming Democratic senators will become the first black women to represent their states, Delaware's Lisa Blunt Rochester and Maryland's Angela Also Brooks. You're listening to NPR News from Washington.
And this is WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. Good morning. I'm Stephen Ponson. It's 9:04. Republicans in Northeast Florida were overwhelmingly successful on Election Day. The GOP swept local and state races, including victories for incumbent state representatives Keon Michael, Jessica Baker, Sam Garrison, and Wyman Duggan. Republican Congressman Aaron Bean, John Rutherford, and Michael Waltz also kept their seats, and U.S. Senator Rick Scott won handily over Democratic challenger Debbie McCarcel-Powell. Duval GOP Chair Dean Black, also a state rep who was reelected last night, was pleased to see Republican voter turnout surpass Democratic turnout in Duval County.
We've been working for years relentlessly, now going on 6 years, to grind down the Democrat Party voter registration lead. You see the results of some of that effort tonight, and those efforts will resume. We'll take a day off to celebrate, but then it'll be right back to work.
Republicans in Duval County cast about 12,000 more ballots than Democrats, despite Democrats' slight voter registration advantage. Meanwhile, Democratic State Senators Tracy Davis and Representative Kim Daniels and Angie Nixon, who represent Jacksonville, faced only write-in candidates. They were also reelected last night. Looking at the weather in Jacksonville today, we have the chance for showers this afternoon. Highs are going to be in the lower 80s. And the rain will stick around into the evening. We'll have cloudy skies overnight with lows in the mid-70s. Tomorrow, another chance for rain, mostly cloudy skies, highs in the lower 80s.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people, and the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, helping NPR advance journalistic excellence in the digital age.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
Good morning. I'm Ann Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Today, the 45th president will now be the 47th. We examine what Donald Trump's decisive victory means for Floridians and discuss the outcome of state and local elections. Later in the program, the sheriff defends his officers' actions as ugly at the Florida-Georgia game, but necessary. But first, the morning after Democrats and their signature issues were defeated across the state and the First Coast, we're turning to the expertise and analysis of Jacksonville attorney and local government expert Chris Hand. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning, Ann.
I know that you had a very late night over at our news partners, News for Jax. Really appreciate you turning it around and coming here so early this morning.
Of course, always good to be here, Ann.
So what are your big takeaways when it comes to Florida last night? What do you think happened in terms of Democrats and the issues that they favored?
Well, I think just from a broader standpoint, Ann, if there was any doubt at this point as to whether Florida still remained a swing state or not, I think those doubts were erased last night. I mean, this was a monumental victory in statewide contests for Republican candidates, both Donald Trump and Rick Scott winning by very similar margins in the range of about 13%, winning the state last night. So I think we are seeing what is a political realignment here in Florida. Again, we've seen certainly signs of that in recent years. The governor's decisive reelection win in 2022, Senator Marco Rubio, similar. This sort of confirms that. You kind of need, you need 2 points to confirm a trend. I think we now see that in the state of Florida, that we've now had 2 elections where Republicans have won statewide by double digits. I think that says a lot of things. Number one, whether that is a result of demographic shifts into Florida, which I think is a major influence there. I think compounded by the fact that national Democrats haven't invested in Florida in the last 2 cycles. Republicans have a very sort of well-funded, well-oiled turnout infrastructure and machine. Democrats don't have that anymore because of recent losses, national Democrats aren't investing in the state anymore. So I think if you're, someone who's active in the Democratic Party here in Florida, this is a moment for some soul searching and to really kind of get back to basics and figure out how do you do that basic blocking and tackling of registering voters and then ultimately turning them out. But for the moment, I think you put Florida solidly in the red column for the foreseeable future.
Were you surprised by the level of support for Republicans? I mean, we had just a few weeks ago been reporting about how close the race appeared to be between Senator Rick Scott and his Democratic challenger. he ended up winning that race by the largest margin he's ever run any race by.
Well, and just to put that in some perspective, when he was elected governor in 2010, he won by 1%. When he was reelected governor in 2014, he won by 1%. When he was elected to the U.S. Senate in 2018, he won by 10,000 votes. So to go from 10,000 votes to winning the state by 13% is a massive, massive shift. And I think it is a sort of a, likely response to some of those factors we talked about. A lot of Republican voters moving into the state and Democrats just sort of, taking their foot off the gas nationally in terms of investing in Florida. Republicans have a much stronger registration and turnout infrastructure. So even if the polls looked closer at some point, you have to get voters to the polls and make sure people actually cast ballots. Republicans are much better situated to do that in Florida than Democrats are. And until that situation changes, until Democrats can make a dent in that million voter deficit they have from a registration standpoint and build effective turnout operations again, I think we're likely to see similar results going forward.
We're talking to Chris Hand about yesterday's election, what it means for Florida, what it means for the nation. We've got a few calls here. Jim in Orange Park. Good morning, Jim. Go ahead.
Hi, Ann. Thanks for taking my call. Appreciate the show. So I just want to say a couple of things. One thing is I'm a 30-year Navy vet. My father served in the Marine Corps. My father-in-law did 20 years in the Navy. Both my kids served in the military. One is still on active duty. So I just wanted to say I don't consider us suckers or losers like President Trump says. And quite frankly, I fear for my son who's on active duty that he might be put in harm's way. As a teacher, I think that this is the first time since 2004 that a Republican president has won the popular vote. And so I just want to say that apparently I live in a racist, sexist, misogynistic, homophobic country where in my profession, the president couldn't even pass a background check. I feel hopelessness. I lived in Europe when President Obama was elected, and the overpouring of joy around the world that I saw when that happened, gave me hope for democracy. The next 4 years, as Benjamin Franklin said when he left the Constitutional Convention, a woman came up and said, "Well, Mr. Franklin, what do we have?" He said, "Madam, we have a republic." He paused and then said, "If we can keep it. I pray that we can." Thanks, Ann, for taking my call.
Thanks, Jim, for your feedback. I mean, there's no question, Chris, that people on both sides of this presidential election had very dire predictions and thoughts about what could happen if their side lost. And Jim's voice reflects what a lot of people on the Democratic side fear.
Well, first of all, thank you to Jim for his service and to his family for their service. And in Jim's case, both as a as a veteran and as a teacher. What I would say to people this morning, and look, we see this in every election, where, the side that emerges victorious, there's a sense of excitement and euphoria. The side that is not successful obviously feels very concerned about what this might mean for the future. The one thing I want to encourage people to think about this morning, and and as you know, I had the great privilege to work for most of my adult life with, my boss and mentor and very good friend, Bob Graham. And we wrote a book called America, the Owner's Manual, which is about effective citizenship. And I think it's really important for people to remember that the top of the organizational chart in this country is citizens. As citizens, we have the most important role in American democracy. We can use our effective citizenship skills to make government move in our direction. So for those who feel hopelessness, whether it's because of this result or something else as it relates to government, I know it's maybe hard to see if you're not happy with the election results this morning, but we have agency, we have effective citizenship powers, and we can use those to try and move government at any level, whether it's local, state, or federal, in our direction. So the day after an election is often a kind of a tough time to give that piece of counsel, particularly if one's candidate was not successful. But I hope people will keep that in mind, that we as citizens have some ability to shape the course of future events. We don't have to rely just on electoral outcomes or politicians.
I want to get to another call in just a second, but just briefly, is it possible that there would be a silver lining for people like Jim who have been fearful of election denial or, a loss of people's faith in the electoral system to fairly deliver an election. Is it possible that a, a victory by Donald Trump, who kind of sowed those doubts primarily, might actually restore some faith in voter democracy?
Well, look, what we won't have going forward, obviously for the next several months is, I mean, this was a decisive victory. I mean, President Trump obviously won the popular vote. Looks like he's headed for an electoral college landslide, kind of one maybe similar to the size Joe Biden had in 2020. There's no question as to who won the election. There won't be questions about that. One way or the other, the country will be able to move forward into a new administration. And, collectively as citizens, it will be our job to hold not just that administration and the new Congress. We're not sure exactly who's going to control. We think the Republicans will control the Senate. The House is still kind of to be determined. It'll be our job as citizens to hold every level of government accountable, because that's always been our job, at the top of the organizational chart. So what I would say for anybody who was disappointed with the outcome last night, this doesn't have to be the end of something. It can be the beginning of a new activation of our effective citizenship powers, but we have to make that choice to do that.
If you want to join our conversation, you can call us at 904-549-2937. You can email comments or questions to First Coast Connect at WJCT.org, or you can reach out on social media. We've got a call from Wells on the South Side. Good morning, Wells. Go ahead.
Good morning, Ann. Good morning, Mr. Han and Ann. I just want to do a brief, deeper assessment of what's happening. Trump ran a redemption campaign, and it was a redemption period in America, and it was a movement to return white control in the South. But what really won last night, and would have won no matter who was elected, is a continuation of an economic system that needs to make some serious changes. Capitalism, imperialism, colonialism is still plaguing us. The war against the Palestinian people will continue. That will widen. We still don't have universal health care here. Housing is, people are in a crisis around housing. So it's the economic system of capitalism that needs to be evaluated. And I'll end with this. Malcolm X said, you can't have capitalism without racism. And that's the campaign that Donald Trump ran on. And we see that we still have not dealt with this issue. Thank you.
Thanks, Wells. Chris, I want to move to talking about the amendments, because while those both won a majority of support, the two that kind of got the most attention, legalizing marijuana and the abortion amendment, they both were defeated. Tell me what you think was at play in those, enormously expensive races, ones that got tons of attention and tons of political input from both sides.
Well, I mean, first of all, just to take us back, obviously in Florida, unlike many other states, because, for example, there were abortion amendments in other parts of the country, including Missouri and Arizona, that did pass yesterday, because that's sort of a simple majority threshold as opposed to a supermajority threshold like we have here in Florida. And that threshold was put in the Florida Constitution. Voters approved it in 2006 in the aftermath of things like the Pregnant Pigs Amendment, that people felt like maybe constitutional amendments did not have a high enough bar. I think there were a lot of factors that went into it. Obviously, 57 or 58% is an overwhelming majority support. But when you have to get to that supermajority threshold, any significant amount of opposition can help to prevent that. And I think there was, we saw this. I mean, look, not just privately funded opposition, but obviously very controversial. The state itself invested significant money, taxpayer dollars, in opposing both Amendment 3 and Amendment 4, and, tried to, stop pro-Amendment 4 advertising at certain broadcast stations. I think all of that had an impact. I think also the overall turnout in Florida, the overall spread as it relates to the presidential race and the U.S. Senate race also had an impact there, going down the ticket to the amendment. So when you have to get to 60%, it's a situation where anything can derail reaching that high threshold, and there was a lot of opposition to that.
As you noted, that's an amendment that citizens approved in 2006, and the great irony of that was that it passed with just 57 66.7% of the vote, so it would not have met its own threshold to pass.
Right.
But there's even been some movement in recent years to raise that threshold. There was a couple of lawmakers proposing a 66.67 threshold. And there is some belief that, certain things just don't belong in the Constitution. Do you think that these issues will be taken up legislatively instead, given the support for them?
My guess would be no. The legislature's already made a policy declaration on the issue of abortion by implementing the 6-week ban. It seems unlikely they're going to revisit that. The issue of marijuana could be different, although, again, seems unlikely. I think the one potential difference maker there is, one person who endorsed Amendment 3 is the next president of the United States, Donald Trump, who has said that, he plans to continue the Biden administration's policies of kind of moving marijuana from a Schedule 1 drug to a Schedule 3 drug. So that could be a source, sort of an impetus for some legislative action on the issue of marijuana. We'll have to obviously sort of track that over time. On the issue of abortion, I don't think there's likely to be any legislative action on that because the legislature's already spoken on this, and the composition of the legislature going forward is going to be very similar to what it was when they passed that 6-week ban.
And certainly when you talk about the state opposition of these two, that was led by the governor. He really planted his flag on these issues, and you'd really have to be going against him as well if you wanted to take it up.
That's right. And again, I just don't see any appetite to do that on the legislature's part. I think they'll be able to point to this result, even though there was strong majority support, as not having sufficient support to pass. And so I just don't think it's likely, barring significant changes in the composition of the legislature in future years, that this will be something they take up legislatively. On that point, Ann, I think one thing that these debates over how we do constitutional amendments has kind of reminded us is that what we don't have in Florida is a statutory initiative process where people can go through a similar process to putting constitutional amendments on the ballot to make statutory changes. And this has been something written about. A law school classmate of mine wrote about this many years ago about Florida not having the statutory initiative process. I think that's something that could get some attention in the state going forward is should we have the ability not just to amend the Florida Constitution, but the ability to amend the Florida statutes as well. We'll be curious to see if that becomes an issue or a debate.
Interesting. We've got a call from Sally in Springfield. Good morning, Sally. Go ahead.
Good morning. Yes, thank you. I just wanted to add to the conversation in light of what happened with Amendment 3 and 4 and the conversation about voters having agency. We didn't really have agency in this with the governor putting forward, I read it was up to $50 million towards defeating the only 2 amendments on our ballot that were brought forward by citizens. Like, this seems like it's illegal to me. It's, in my opinion, completely unethical, but it's a frustration that makes the idea that we have agency weak.
Sally, I think we lost you, but I guess I get the picture. When you have a citizens initiative as opposed to the other constitutional amendments, the other 4 that were on the ballot this time, those were all proposed by lawmakers.
Correct.
Some of them brought forth by lobbyists, but these 2 were the only ones that the citizens actually got the signatures, put them on the ballot. And then to have the state oppose those does have a particular sting, I would guess, for people who supported them.
Yeah, and I think that is a concern. Does that have a chilling effect going forward? Look, what the state did was unprecedented. And as you said, Ann, many have argued, based on some what seems to be very clear statutory language, that it was potentially unlawful. Not just the use of taxpayer dollars to fund this, but also, the somewhat heavy-handed approaches of the Department of Health sending notices to broadcast TV stations, strongly urging them to remove pro-Amendment 4 advertising. That was, of course, enjoined by a federal judge. I think what I mean by that is there's a governor's race coming up in 2026. There are legislative races every 2 years. In my opinion, for people who are disappointed by last night's results, and again, I know it's very difficult on a day after. I've been involved with a lot of campaigns myself. I completely get it. But I think it is also important to remember that every day is a new day. Every election is a new election. The entire Florida cabinet will be on the ballot in 2026. The legislature, half of the Senate and the entire Florida House of Representatives will be on the ballot in 2026. There are continuing opportunities to hold government officials accountable, and there's a set of skills of effective citizenship we can do to do that. It's hard to see if you're disappointed in the results. It's hard to see that today, but there are opportunities for future engagement and future ability to impact the course and scope of government.
I want to ask you just more broadly for people who are thinking about, the presidential landscape. You're a lawyer. I'm just curious, what things are you most aware of in terms of once Donald Trump takes office once again, his priorities, whether they'll, live up to some of the more extreme interpretations of what those could look like, or whether there will be more of a push to moderate those promises.
I don't think we know the answer to that question at this point. And I mean, look, this is a unique situation. I mean, unique except for I don't know that we have adequate data on what happened during the second Grover Cleveland administration from 1992 to 1892 to 1896.
Was the last time
The
that
last time that someone won a second non-consecutive term as president. But, I think there are probably a lot of clues to look at. Number one, what did President Trump do during his first term in office? That probably kind of gives some sense of what his agenda might be. Also, I think it's important to listen to candidates on when they are campaigning for office. What is it they say they want to do? And in fact, in his speech last night, after it was, when we came out and declared victory, President Trump said, the mantra of his second term is going to be promises made, promises kept. So I think they do have an active governing agenda. I think there are, particularly because both Donald Trump won the presidency and Republicans have taken control of the Senate, there are a couple of early issues to look at. One is confirmation of his appointees. So looking at who he appoints to those key cabinet roles and other positions that require Senate confirmation. Because he's got a Republican Senate, that path to confirmation just got a lot easier. And speaking of confirmations, you've got a couple of members of the United States Supreme Court who have been on the court for quite some time, who might be considering sort of retirement.
Which two are those?
Well, Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, maybe even John Roberts at this point. But there's
All conservative members.
All conservative members who have been on the court for, I think the shortest tenure of all of those is Samuel Alito, who's been on the court now for about 18 years. John Roberts for, a similar amount of time. He was confirmed a year before Justice Alito. And, of course, Clarence Thomas has been on the court since 1991. So you've got justices who have decades on the court now who were appointed by Republican presidents. I would not be surprised to see 2 or 3 retirements during this second Trump term, which would effectively mean, again, with Republican control of the Senate, would effectively mean that Donald Trump will have appointed, maybe as many as 6 members of the 9-person Supreme Court.
Wow.
That has a huge. We've already seen the impacts of appointments to the court by various presidents, but President Trump in particular, the appointments he made during his first term. One of the results from that was the Jackson v. Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade. With additional appointees, that's a legacy that a president leaves, depending on who he or she nominates for the court.
I just briefly want to ask you what you anticipate will happen. There's a lot of criminal cases pending, a conviction that's already happened. What do you think is going to happen on that front?
I think all of those are going to go away, and in various ways. I think the 2 federal cases, is important to sort of distinguish the 2 of those. One of those has already been dismissed. The judge in the Southern District of Florida had dismissed the classified documents case. It has been taken up on appeal. It seems very unlikely that appeal will be resolved prior to President Trump taking office. So I think that case likely goes away. The January 6th case, I think, also likely to go away. I mean, Donald Trump will appoint the Attorney General of the United States, which will be, one of the officials confirmed by the Senate. It seems very unlikely that whoever that Attorney General is will continue that January 6th case. The federal government will probably drop that one. There are 2 state cases. There's a New York case in which President Trump was actually convicted of a number of felonies. He's due to be sentenced in November. Seems highly unlikely that sentencing is now going to go forward. The country has rendered a verdict of its own in reelecting him president. So I think that state court judge is likely to maybe defer that sentencing until after President Trump, completes this second term in January of 2029. And then, of course, there's a case pending in Georgia, which has been beset by a number of challenges. Again, remember that a president enjoys, absolute immunity from prosecution while serving as president. And so particularly given that he's going to take office on January 20th, that case in Georgia is not going to move forward. It's already tied up in a variety of appeals and other sort of procedural disputes. So I think the bottom line is those 4 criminal cases in one form or fashion will cease to exist effectively as of January 20th, 2025.
Well, Chris and we always appreciate your analysis and all of your smarts. Thanks for bringing him to the station this morning after your long night last night. Thank you so much.
Good to see you as always, Ann. Thank you.
All right. Up next, what the sheriff says really happened before an officer beatdown circulating on social media. Welcome back. The sheriff's office pushed back forcefully on a social media narrative criticizing officer conduct during 2 arrests at the Florida-Georgia game last week. Here to talk about the incident and the response is retired police detective Kim Varner, a 26-year veteran with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. Hey, Kim.
Hey, Ken. How are you doing this morning?
Good. Nice to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
We're also joined by longtime Jacksonville defense attorney Shannon Schott. Good morning, Shannon.
Good morning.
Thanks for being here. So these videos began circulating shortly after the game. They showed officers tasing and repeatedly punching fans in 2 separate incidents. And these videos almost immediately caught the attention of officials, the mayor's office saying she had talked to Sheriff T.K. Waters, JSO saying they were looking into it. But Kim, a lot of people immediately branded what they saw as police brutality. Even some of the observers there yelling, this is assault. What was your take on the videos?
Well, after looking at the complete video and not just what was on social media, the officers, in my opinion, were totally justifiable. The officers asked, and what the community needs to understand, I like educating the community on the way the sheriff's office works. And what happens at a game, any game, NFL game or a college game, if the safe employees come to us and say, I need to evict this person out the stadium or eject this person out the stadium, our job is to eject that person from the stadium. We don't take your argument up with the officer. The officer has nothing to do with that. You need to talk to the safe management people about, why you're being removed.
And those are employees, basically, they're employed by the stadium.
Right.
Safe is the name of the officer that
Safe is
patrols.
the name of the it's kind of like security people that work there in the stadium. And my thing is just like a traffic stop. If you get stopped by the police and you don't agree with what the officer is doing, you don't pick a fight with the officer there on the streets. You wait and you file a complaint the correct way. You wait, get his name, his badge number, and you call internal and you file a complaint. Well, the same thing happens here at the stadium. If you're not satisfied with what the officer's telling you, still leave and comply and take up the complaint. File a complaint the right way. In both of these incidents, they didn't do that. They refused to leave, and one of Walter Brown actually made threats to the officer, saying that if I go to jail, I'm going to kick your so and so.
Yeah, I want to get to that, but I mean, in terms of there not being there's no way to litigate that. You're saying that the officer really has no choice. Once the safe officer has said, I want these people ejected, the officer kind of must eject
Right.
them.
The officer's job is to eject them.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So by Monday afternoon, the sheriff had prepared a hour-long presentation that aired pretty much live on local TV stations. I want to just play a little bit of what he had to say about that social media video.
Social media is not necessarily real, or at least what you see on social media is not a real depiction of what's actually going on. Once again, we're seeing an intentionally misleading video clip, one lacking proper context pushed out on social media to drive a false narrative. As a leader of this agency, I will not remain silent while important facts and information are buried to advance an anti-police agenda. Won't do it. It's just not going to happen.
So Shannon Schott, this, as I said, was about an hour-long presser taken full on local TV stations. How effective was this response by the sheriff's office?
Well, it's very effective in the sense that now everyone thinks that the police were completely justified. But, respectfully to Kim, I would disagree with his characterization of the officer's authority in the moment when you're told by an agency where you're working secondary employment, right? So the community has to understand that these officers were hired in like a private capacity by the stadium to provide additional help, right? And when you have someone saying like, I need to eject this person, one of the considerations is you have to actually do a little bit of investigation in order to trespass someone and have them not complying with Florida law. So one of the concerns I had in this video was that there wasn't a lot of investigation. It's you're leaving and you see these people in the lower bowl incident asking why, like, I'm not going. And I think there's also a disconnect with these people who've come, paid hundreds of dollars for this event. It's supposed to be like a positive event and they're not comprehending that they are now in a police situation. And I don't think they understood the gravity of the situation and the possible outcomes that we ended up seeing on social media.
And so they were challenging, basically, they were wanting to have a conversation.
Right.
They were wanting to plead their case, at least in that lower bowl case. It was a very different interaction in the first arrest of the two, which involved Walter Brown. He was the Georgia fan as opposed to the kind of Florida fans in the second incident. He immediately was very hostile, repeatedly used the N-word against the officer who was a black man, and made threats.
Right. And in that situation, the officers are actively observing a dangerous person in the situation, and they had every right to eject him. And as Kim explained, when you resist an officer, the officer does have the right to use force and meet force with force. The bigger concern from a liability perspective and a criminal perspective is the Alexander Long and Michael Long, the two men who were the Florida fans in the lower bowl, where they're trying to explain what they have said to you, what these security guards are saying to you is not accurate. Talk to these people. And there was no criminal investigation done. It was like, you're going. They resisted or said no multiple times. And then finally you see a lieutenant who said, oh, you're not going to go, and then starts a physical interaction with Michael Long, and then Alexander Long jumps in.
Did you think that reaction was too intense at that point?
Yeah, and I know that Sheriff Waters says, oh, what you see on social media, I can't believe, but it's a video, and it has a clear shot of the sergeant's face, and you see him getting very agitated, very upset, and he was just done with these individuals, and then he physically grabbed them. A lawful arrest or a lawful stop can still result in brutality or excessive force is the way that I would refer to that.
Okay. If you're just joining us, we are talking about the sheriff's response to social media videos that had garnered some criticism taken at the Florida-Georgia game. If you'd like to join the conversation, you can reach us at 904-549-2937 or email us at firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. You can also comment or tag us on social media. Kim Varner, what do you think about that? I mean, the officer, I want to ask you, first of all, if you think that even though it was different officers involved, if that first incident might have inflamed the second incident in any way. Does there kind of get to be any general understanding of what's going on, a level of volatility at an event like that might produce a heightened response?
Well, if I'm not mistaken, one incident, the first one with Walter Brown occurred like 4-something, and I think the other one occurred like 6-something. So I doubt if they had anything to, as a reaction from the other one. And they're in separate areas of the stadium. But there were 35 ejections at the game. And the simple thing is just comply. If you comply, neither of these gentlemen would have been arrested. They were just going to be ejected. And that's the whole thing to me. I mean, now you're going to jail. You have a charge when you're just going to be ejected. And if you would have complied and taken it up the right way to file your complaint, it would have never happened. Would have went down like it went down. What I want people to understand is that as an officer working at a Florida Georgia game, I don't remember exactly how many officers TK said. I think he said like 28 officers working inside the stadium, and there are thousands of people. It's the world's biggest cocktail party. People are drunk before that game gets started. I worked down there. I worked for the sheriff's office 26 years. I worked the Florida Georgia game probably like 12 to 14 years. Very seldom worked it in uniform. I worked in uniform like 3 or 4 times because I refused to work it in uniform for that same reason. You're pretty much putting yourself in I won't say in harm's way, but you're putting yourself in the position where you're going to have to probably go hands-on with somebody because people get drunk and get crazy down there. That's the bottom line. I mean, it's a good time. I get that. I like to go out and have a good time myself, but, when you're dealing with a lot of people that are drinking heavily, a lot of college kids that are drinking heavily, and as an officer, especially during these times that we're in right now, officers aren't getting any love, too much love from the community. So there's no way I would work that game if I was still on the department. And what I would like to add something on an incident with the loans. The sergeant actually, the officers actually told those guys that
And
they
the
had to
longs
leave.
are the kind of the Georgia fans that
This
the
is
Florida
the
fans
Florida
down
fans,
in the lower
right?
bowl.
In the lower bowl, Michael Long and I forgot what his son. I think it was his son. Is whatever his name was, or whatever. But anyway, the officers had asked them to leave several times. Told them they had to leave several times. They refused. One time, he actually walked to the aisle, and the officer told him he had to leave. He said, "Well, unless you're taking these 2 guys back here, I'm not going." And he walked back to his seat. And when he said, "I'm not going," that's when the sergeant intervened and said, "You're not going, you are going." He reached out for him. When he reached out for him, he pushed the sergeant away and then drew his fist up in a striking position. And when sergeant reached out to grab him, that's when the other long grabbed the sergeant around his chest and fell back with him. One thing you got to realize, you're fighting, and it's pretty much a fight at that point. You're fighting somebody on an incline where you can easily lose your balance. And, you can get hurt. You can get hurt. Both parties can get hurt. But I mean, it's just one of those situations where when you come to work, you don't expect to have to put your hands on people. Most officers don't. You're prepared to if you have to, but I don't think. And usually if officer's wrong, I'll say it. I have no problem saying it if officer's wrong. But in this case, I actually think the officers were justified. I actually think they handled it pretty professionally because once the compliance happened, the violence stopped, and violence don't look good. It's ugly. Violence is very ugly, and it became real violent up there in both situations. But once the individuals start complying, the officers stopped using violence against them and took them into custody and walked them off.
The sheriff actually had a something to say about that point in terms of how it looked. Let's hear what he had to say about that.
I'm glad that they handled it the way that they handled it. They handled it professionally. Though it looks rough, it was done the right way, and everybody came out safely.
I want to take a call from Gilbert in San Marco. Good morning, Gilbert. Go ahead.
Hi, I just wanted to correct your guest, the defense attorney, about a point she made about the police officers. She said they're hired directly by the stadium to work at the football games, and however she put it. That's actually not correct. The police officers there still work for the city. They're still paid by the city. And in a lot of cases, they're instructed to be there. They didn't even choose to work the game. They were told that they had to. I'll take my response off here. Thank you.
Thanks, Gilbert. I mean, there are officers assigned to the game. We know in some cases there are officers who work it in an off-duty capacity, kind of for overtime pay, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's also the safe officers that are employed by the stadium.
Right.
And I don't know which, obviously these weren't safe officers, but whether they chose to be there or were assigned is not clear to me.
And that's what I'm not sure. I know there were several years when I was still on the job that officers didn't want to work that game for this same reason. And they were, commanded to work the job. They were ordered to work the job, like Andrew was saying. So I don't know if that's the situation with this particular game, but I know in the past it has been that way. Fortunately for me, I worked plain clothes, so was never ordered to work it. 3 or 4 times that I worked there, it was by choice, and that was before it got to the point that it is now.
Yeah.
So.
And Shannon, I mean, I guess Gilbert is saying that he seems to think that these officers perhaps didn't have an opportunity to make a decision one way or the other, whether they were there. Whether that matters, I don't know to you.
Yeah, I don't think it matters. What I was saying is that sometimes they have what's called secondary employment, which is basically overtime. And Kim, correct me if I'm wrong, where the officers can actually volunteer. And because what happens is the stadium says we have a need and there are like additional opportunities. So generally with events, you see it happening on what's called a secondary employment, but it doesn't matter. They're still sworn Jacksonville Sheriff's officers at that time. The point is, when you get to the issue of like whether or not these people are going to be able to make a claim against the officers or anything like that, who had the authority to direct the officers to trespass them? Obviously, no crimes were being committed in the presence of these officers, like Kim explained. They're just there to eject people based on what the agents who have authority, the security guards, tell them to do. So it's relevant to the civil liability that might arise out of this, who hired whom, what their authority was, etc. But I mean, at the end of the day, they're still JSO officers, and the question we're talking about today is whether or not the force was excessive. So it doesn't really matter how they got there, in my opinion. But certainly I understand Gilbert's position as well. But one thing Kim said is, you go to that game and you're ready. You know that it's going to be 28 officers versus thousands of people. So you're going in with like this war mentality, right? This like aggressive on the defense mentality. And again, that's kind of the concern here. Could this have been de-escalated? And there are some experts who have said on other platforms that maybe they could have de-escalated the situation a little bit more, asked a few more questions when the fans are trying to not be ejected, maybe heard them out a little bit. And certainly I heard TK Waters again say they handled it well, but there are additional videos, and I don't think the videos are doctored or there's any allegation that these videos are doctored, where these men are on the ground and they're being tased multiple times and they're being hit in the face multiple times while they are laid out on the stairs. Again, is that excessive? I was concerned when I saw it, when you see an elderly 50-year-old man laying on the ground who's intoxicated and not able to really resist to the extent of punching the officer. Certainly they might have been flinching, pulling away, but pulling away is very different, or pushing away is very different from being struck in the face multiple times and tased.
All right. I want to ask you, Kim, they bleeped it out, but we did hear that the one defendant who was on the upper deck, Walter Brown, the Georgia fan, had used the N-word multiple times. And obviously officers aren't allowed to use that as a reason to be violent with anybody or to take on anybody. But in the eyes of the public, perhaps is a mitigating factor when they see something like this as an aggravating element.
Mm-hmm. In this particular case, that's one reason why I say I think the officers handle things professionally, because in this particular case, the officer never cursed him. And I can't. I was a police officer during a different time and a different era, and if that would have happened during my time, the guy probably they would have cursed him and everything else. There probably been some licks passed after he was in cuffs. This never happened in this incident. The officer never cursed. Neither one of the officers in any situation used profanity that I heard. And like I said, when they use force, but once they took the person into custody, the force stopped. And that's something that you have to pay attention to, because a lot of times in a lot of police brutality cases, it don't stop. They'll beat cuffed individuals. They'll beat them even if they're handcuffed. You didn't see that in either one of these situations. And with the guy laying on the ground, they were asking him to give him his hand. And instead of him giving his hand, he put his hand like right here on his neck. If you look at the video, he put his hand right here and he's yelling. He can't move. Well, all he had to do was move. They leaned him up. All he did was at that point put his hand behind his back, and he didn't. They had to physically grab his hand and pull it behind his back. And I can tell you, I'm 6'2", and when I was on the job, I was 6'2", probably about 245, 255, and I worked out in pretty in good shape. But one of the hardest things to do is pull a person's hand behind the back if they're resisting, and that's what you have to do is pull that person's hands behind their back to cuff them. It's a hard thing to do. Like I say, I don't, you know me, Ann, and I don't sit here and just advocate for police officers all the time. Even though I'm an officer, I just try and call it like it is and say what's right.
Right.
And if it's right, it's right.
Yeah.
And I think these officers I thought they was actually pretty professional because, like I say, they didn't use any profanity. No licks were passed after they had them in cuffs and none of that. So I thought they were pretty professional.
Shannon, we just got about 20 seconds left. Do you anticipate litigation?
I do. I anticipate that at least the Longs will probably do something. There's enough attorneys out there who might advise them that they have a claim. And certainly it's a really tough question, and probably will be for a jury to decide.
All right. Well, Kim Varner, Shannon Schott, thanks so much for coming in today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Up next, a festival highlighting the literary life of the First Coast.
Congaree & Pen, dedicated to agriculture and culinary endeavors, offering field-to-fork dining and outdoor experiences on over 300 acres. Sip, dine, explore. Information at congareeandpen.com. Life South Community Blood Centers, providing blood and patient services to the local hospitals, serving patients in this community. Donating blood with Life South helps save lives. More at lifesouth.org to find a blood drive near you.
On the next Fresh Air, Oscar nominee Saoirse Ronan. She has 2 new films in theaters, The Outrun, about a young alcoholic trying to get sober, and Blitz, about a mother in London during the World War II German bombardment, trying to find her lost son. Her other films include Little Women, Lady Bird, Brooklyn, and Atonement. Join us.
Today at noon on WJCT News 89.9.
Just 7 swing states, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, will help decide the fate of the 2024 presidential election. We'll get the latest from the finest local journalists in those states on how Election Day went and what's happening on the ground now. That's on the next On Point.
Today at 11, here on WJCT News 89.9.
What do the election results tell us about who we are? Was it the outcome you hoped and voted for? Leave us a message at 855-236-1A1A or use our app, 1A Vox Pop. Next time on 1A, we have analysis, debate, but most important of all, your reaction as our new political landscape becomes clear.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. Well, after all this discussion of elections and social media mayhem, you may be in the mood for something elevating, even literary. Fortunately, it's time for the 11th annual JaxbyJax Literary Art Festival. Here to tell us about it is Kathleen Shelton-Gilmore, director of JaxbyJax XI. That's 11 for those of you who don't speak Roman numeral. Welcome, Kathleen.
Thank you.
We're also joined by the event's founder, Tim Gilmore, no relation, also an author and publisher of the blog JaxPsychoGeo. Hey, Tim.
Hey, Ann.
Thanks for being here. So, Tim, first of all, this is the 11th year. What inspired you in the first place to create JaxbyJax?
Yeah, thanks. It seems like it was 100 years ago and a year ago, but it was, it was the kind of thing that I wanted to see happen in my town. And there were already, obviously, other good literary things happening in Jacksonville. Jacksonville, I think, has in some ways, surprising, strong literary community. And so my initial desire was to showcase the city, to showcase writers based here. And it was, JaxbyJax the idea was, Jacksonville writing Jacksonville.
Yeah. And you have really done a lot to, you tell the story of Jacksonville in almost everything you do, whether it's, biographies of famous people or totally unknown people until you make them famous, or on your blog, JaxPsychoGeo, you really, tell all of these amazing, dark, unknown stories of Jacksonville. But other people are doing it as well, and it really is makes for a very interesting tapestry, kind of the story of Jacksonville.
Yeah, it's stunningly rich, the tapestry, whether it's people writing about the city, or it's people who are based here. I mean, I think of like Sohrab Fraisis, who's has an international reputation, won the Iowa Writers Award, which is one of the most prestigious awards you can
Sure.
win. Katie has done incredible things with poetry and other things in Jacksonville for years now. And I know Katie will be mentioning, but having Mike Wiley and Tia Levings at the festival this year, those Mike writes this incredible noir stuff, some of which is set in Chicago, some of which is set in Jacksonville. Tia's a New York Times bestseller, whose book is based here.
Yeah, we just recently had Michael on, Michael Wiley. He had an extraordinary book that's kind of told in verse. It's
Yeah.
really amazing effort. And I introduced you as Kathleen, but we'll call you Katie. So how does it feel to take over the reins at JaxbyJax?
Invigorating. Let's say that. It's been interesting. I have some organizing experience, doing poetry readings in the urban area or urban core of Jacksonville. But this magnitude's a little different, but I've enjoyed it, and I'm really looking forward to this year's festival and what we're gonna do next year as well. So.
And so Tia is one of the names that Tia Levings that Tim mentioned, but tell us a little bit about her and what she's going to be doing at the event.
So Tia will be closing up the event. Her reading is going to be at 4:30 in the multipurpose room 3 on the conference level of the main library.
We should say this event is November 8th and 9th, so it's Friday and Saturday.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So she'll be
And-
closing it out on Saturday.
Yes.
And it's at the downtown main library, the FSCJ. Oh, no, I'm sorry, the downtown main library.
Yeah,
Apologies.
public library.
okay.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, she's reading from her memoir, how she escaped fundamental Christian patriarchy, and it's a really moving account of her experience, and I think it's a lot of people are really excited to come out and hear what she has to say.
There's also an event, kind of a breakfast event with Women Writing for Change,
Yes.
which is a local group that tries to foster, the ability, the community of women writers in the area.
Yeah, so we're having books and bagels with Women Writing for a Change, they're inviting everyone, participants in the reading as well as just people that are coming to listen, to have breakfast and exchange books.
Yeah.
And just have conversations about literacy and writing.
And Tim, this is your baby in a lot of ways. That feel you feel like it's in good hands this year with Katie
yeah,
and
absolutely.
carrying on kind of the tradition you hoped it would.
Yeah. So so I say that I disorganized it for 4 years, and then Darlene Kuhn took it over for 6 years, and I think professionalized it in ways that I would not have known really how to do. But Darlene kept saying, well, I don't want to let you down because it's your baby, and I would say it's not a literal baby, Having said that, I think it's in great hands this year,
Right.
and I'm thrilled to have Katie at the helm.
All right. Well, Friday and Saturday at the downtown main library. It's free and open to the public. It's JaxbyJax Literary Festival. Tim Gilmore, Katie Shelton-Gilmore, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Ann.
All right. And that's our program. Thank you so much for listening. If you have feedback or suggestions, please send them to First Coast Connect at WJCT.org. Join us tomorrow when we talk with a behavioral economist about why we tend to assume the worst about people with opposing political views and how recognizing it can help heal a polarized society. I'm Ann Schindler. You've been listening to First Coast Connect on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or BaptistJax.com. The North Florida TPO is committed to shaping our transportation future. We're focused on planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, connected community. Learn more at northfloridatpo.com. The Museum of Science and History presents Mission Astronaut, a new exhibition exploring life in space. Mission Astronaut is open September 21st through January 5th. More info at mosh.org.
This is WJCT News.